Bueno, vamos a comenzar. Yo voy a hacer la entrevista en inglés para que el profesor Harberger pueda explayarse cómodamente. Él conoce también español o castellano. Y después vamos a dar un espacio para preguntas que pueden hacerlas en inglés o castellano. Si hay alguna dificultad la traducimos del castellano al inglés. Así que empezamos. Well, it is a great honor to receive the visit of Professor Arnold Harberger. His influence in the economic profession has been very significant, beginning in the 50s and going through the 60s and the 70s, jointly with Friedman, Stigler, Schultz, Becker, Johnson, Mandel, and many others professional economists, gave shape to a beautiful framework for economic analysis that today we have incorporated in most of the textbooks when we are teaching economic finance, economic development, microeconomics, monetary theory. And he has been working for many decades. At the beginning he was professor at the University of Chicago, and presently he is professor at the University of California, Los Ángeles. There are hundreds of students all over the world. Many of them are in Argentina. We have students from Arnold Harberger in CEMA, in University of Buenos Aires, in Córdoba, Tucumán, Mendoza, and maybe other provinces that I don't remember. But surely they're either coming from graduate students in Chicago or in UCLA. We have plenty of them here and in other countries in South America. So I will start my interview with Arnold Harberger talking about the best contribution to economic theory, but I will have a word of caution on that, because I remember in a similar interview done to Jorge Luis Borges, he was asked about the Aleph. So that's a story about one point in space where they would merge all other points in space, and it was a fiction short story of Borges. And the immediate answer of Borges was, I don't know why they kept asking me about the Aleph. Aleph is not my favorite word, so it's not the one that I have great happiness to work with. And so probably I would be tempted to consider the three basic postulates that one word that many of your students appreciated a lot, to have the opportunity to go through that excellent paper. But you have had a lot of interviews about that. So the ones that are really interested in a long interview on the three basic postulates, there is in the web a conference given by asking all the questions about that special piece of work. So I am going to take one or two questions from this paper later on, but I will rather start with what Professor Harberger published in our Journal of Applied Economics in year 1998, and that was a letter to a younger generation. So I will get some points from that question, but from that paper, but I would rather start now asking Alito Harberger, what do you think was your best intellectual work?
Oh my, I find that extremely hard. I think overall the work on the incidence of the corporation income tax is quite important, and it had some originality to it, so that adds some element to that story. And I started that the publication was in 1962, and it was a model of the economy that looked at the tax in general equilibrium, and it had labor and capital in a corporate sector and a non-corporate sector, and the corporation tax was viewed as a tax on capital just in the corporate sector, a partial factor tax, and how that worked its way through the economy. They developed in that under certain circumstances the burden could fall on labor even. But the basic result of that was that it didn't fall in one place all the time. It depended on the substitutability between labor and capital, the substitutability between corporate and non-corporate products and so on. But the judgment call at the end was that most likely it was borne half or more than half or all or a little more than all by capital. Not by shareholders, but by owners of capital. Why owners of capital? Because you have a capital market. And the capital market isn't going to have shareholders earning 3% and everybody else earning 6%. It has to be even. And then later, I extended this model to the world economy, open economy. And in the open economy, that issue of the capital market really working. One country puts a tax on capital and the other countries don't, and the capital runs away. And the people who remain capitalists in that tax country are not seriously suffering. If capital bears the tax, it's worldwide capital bears the tax. Bondholders, shareholders, English, Russian, whoever. And so in that sense, an action by a single country in an open economy on corporation tax ends up hitting labor, because labor can't move, or significantly can't move. It moves a little, but capital moves very fluidly across countries. So my story about the corporation tax today is, if the major countries of the world move all their taxes together, more or less, as they more or less have done, it was about 50% when I started writing, and now it's around less than 30%. So that drop of pretty much all the major countries in the corporation income tax. I want to use the closed economy model. But if one country changes its tax, whether it's the United States, a big country, or Argentina, a smaller country, doesn't matter. That impact is going to be on labor in that country. Lowering the tax helps labor, raising the tax hurts labor. So that is one main thing that I feel happy about. The other thing is that I have worked in cost-benefit analysis from almost before it became a serious topic in economics. And we have an issue in the world that economics has contributed considerably to the improvement of tax policy around the world. When I started work in economics, there was no value-added tax anywhere in the world. The French started it in 1953. Today, it is the tax which yields more revenue than any other tax in the world. And it's not a perfect tax, and it's administered sometimes less well and sometimes better. We economists like broad-based tax at a uniform rate, and sometimes you have different things. But nonetheless, in terms of how much it messes up the economy, the value-added tax is probably the best one around to get money without interrupting economic processes. And tariffs used to be in Argentina. I remember 400% tariffs right here on automobiles. So they're way down from where they were all over the world. So tax policy has improved greatly in my lifetime. But the government expenditure side is not much better than before. And what's the problem there? Well, the problem is that you can change tax policy with 10 good economists in the Ministry of Finance. But you can't improve expenditures with 10 economists or with 100 or with 1,000 even. You can't say roads are good and ports are bad. You know, there are good ports and bad ports, and good roads and bad roads, and good welfare projects and bad welfare projects. Every single thing has to be analyzed. And we have a methodology, which is cost-benefit analysis, which my work has helped to develop, and we are very, it's a solid core of good applied economics based on applied welfare economics that dates back to Adam Smith and Ricardo and Marshall and so on. So the work in a benefit cost analysis of developing a detailed methodology that can help people answer questions when they come across difficult problems in application. That I feel, if I say, what is the thing that maybe economic scientists like most, it would be the corporation income tax side of the thing. What is the thing that may have more importance in terms of its impact on real world events, making something a little better here or a little better there and so on? It's the working cost benefit analysis.
Okay. Now I will, going through this letter to the younger generation, that it is not directly linked to the academic work of Professor Harberger. He has mentioned the corporation income tax and the work that he has done in taxes, value added, and project evaluation. But now he has been policy advisor all over the world. So some of the recommendations that we have in this letter to the younger generation are in a way some kind of policy advice to students or policy makers. And I will go through some of them. In particular, one of the points that you did in that paper was maintaining a healthy skepticism on modeling international capital flows. So it is related to taxes too, but in particular, what we have been experiencing in the last few years is a sort of problem with respect to the way the capital flows come in and out, and it is a serious problem. And at that time, he used the word, I was troubled with the assumption of an infinite elastic supply curve of credit and capital. Are you still troubled?
Yes, indeed, I am. And well, I mean, the line goes like this, that many economic models pretend that the flow of capital around the world is perfect. It is not perfect. It is very substantial. And between United States and Canada, it's pretty close to perfect. Between United States and the major centers of Europe and Japan, it's also pretty close to perfect. But if you find a country that is in some kind of fiscal difficulty, not to mention this one, and you say, well, there is this, capital's available, you just pay 6% and you get all you want. So they'll throw you out of the window of the finance ministry if you give them that kind of advice, because they know you can't do that. So, for many, many purposes, we have to think that the supply curve of foreign funds that a country faces is somewhat upward sloping. That the more the country borrows, the more indebted the country is, the higher will be the real rate of return and interest that it will have to pay. And that is a very important thing even in project evaluation. Because if that curve is flat, you save and that money goes broad. That is to say, any given individual saving does not add to investment in the country. Every investment is effectively financed from abroad, and every saving goes abroad, and therefore the relevant discount rate for the country is just the international interest rate. That is not a realistic view, even for the United States. So this is where the skepticism comes in.
Okay, I will go back then later on to the same question, but with a different perspective. Now let me go through now about you were also skeptical about the modeling of monetary theory, money and banking theory, and you put a lot of emphasis in looking at a consolidated financial system and looking at the M2 sort of variable for modeling. Could you tell us now a little bit more about that? What do you think that's the way?
That's a very interesting point. People always they teach monetary theory, money, and so on, and many people thinking of central banks think that, well, we can analyze monetary policy in terms of the assets and liabilities of the central bank. How much money does it create, and so on. We call the central bank money M0, high-powered money, base money, all those words are there. I think that thinking about central bank policy in terms of its balance sheet is dumb. It's just not a sensible way to look at that. The central bank has a responsibility for the economy of the country. That's why it's there. And if it focuses only on its little corner, it's going to make a lot of mistakes. The target of central bank policy ought to be the good operation of the economy. Now, broadly speaking, I think now in terms of a circumstance where people are trying to decide how much monetary balances they're going to hold. Milton Friedman used to talk about how many weeks or months of salary you have in your bank account and in your pocket. And many people think of that in relation to what fraction of GDP are people holding in monetary balances. All of this is in real terms, real monetary balance. So people are deciding how much monetary balances they want to hold. But the central bank has no option to issue real balances. It creates nominal balances. So you have the nominal money that is created by the central bank and influenced by the central bank. And then you have the real one that people are deciding they want to hold, maybe. And why do we get inflation from too much money? It's because something, how the central bank or the system has given people more money than they want to hold. They're getting rid of it by spending, and that's pushing up the prices. So my whole idea of the dynamics of inflation is people having more balances, nominal balances, than they want to hold in real terms, and therefore they spend. And if they have too little real balances, they will unspend. They will hold back to build up their balances. So what is the big task of a central bank? It is to try to, if people want more nominal cash, no real cash rather, they're going to create deflation. But if the central bank gives them the cash, then they won't have the deflation. If people have too much balances, they will create inflation. But if the central bank absorbs the money, they won't have the inflation. So the big target of central bank policy is to vary not M0, but the quantity of broad money in such a way that you're giving people what they want. And if they have that, you'll neither have inflation nor deflation. I once sat next to Alan Greenspan when he was chairman of the Fed at a dinner, and we were talking, and I expressed these thoughts to him. And I said, you know, what you need in the central bank is the detective work to find out how much balances people really want to hold. Are they having too much or are they having too little? Is that the way you guys think in the Federal Reserve? Yeah, more or less it is. But that detective work is a hell of a lot harder than you make it sound.
Okay, let me follow up on the same question that in the last few years, after we have some of the crises that happens in several developing countries, there was an idea going on in multilateral organizations. I particularly participated in Washington in some of those seminars, where they say, look, in terms of financial policy, we have been looking all the time to, let's say, M2 or the consolidated banking system, the liability side, and we didn't pay too much attention to the asset side. And some of them argue very strongly that the bubbles were more related to the financial disintermediation being produced by the regulation of the banking system in the liability side. And we were not paying too much attention to the growth of credit that were financing any crazy project in the economy. And then, of course, the policy recommendation coming from that analysis would be, let's target the credit, not the M2. What is your reaction to that?
I think to juxtapose the one to the other is wrong, period, just wrong. Why? Because in any consolidated balance sheet, whether it's of the banking system or of a broader financial system, whatever consolidated balance sheet you have that the financial sector is holding credit to the private sector, credit to the public sector, and net foreign assets. Singapore, which is a wonderful model for many others to follow in many, many ways, but they have had as high as 70% of the central bank assets have been foreign exchange. And that is a very high fraction also of the consolidated banking system assets in Singapore. So I think that you need to watch credit. Somebody needs to watch credit to prevent stupidities from happening. And in our recent bubble in the United States, there is no question in my mind that that bubble would never have happened. This is a strong statement. Never have happened if our politicians had not forced the banks to give loans to people who were too poor to be able to comfortably repay those loans. These subprime lending was required by law. So that was the first mistake. And then somebody else packaged these crazy credits into securitized loans. That made them more transactable. Then, that was maybe the second mistake. I'm not sure it was a mistake, but it was there. Then, as a third step, our rating agencies incorrectly and falsely put AAA ratings on those packages, and they were sold all over the world, so that at the moment our crisis hit, nearly all the major banks of England, the continent of Europe, the United States, had these packages, and they were going to be going way down. Now, some of these banks had taken out a sort of insurance on the packages, and that insurance was given by a company called AIG. But when this thing hit, this crisis hit, AIG didn't have the money to cover that insurance. And three heroes, Paulson, Bernanke, and Geithner, meeting over a weekend, made a decision to support completely AIG in meeting its commitments on these insurances. And with that, they saved the world economy over one weekend. But in the process, that and other things, the accumulation of toxic assets by the central bank, was in a magnitude never before seen in central banking. They saved the world economy, and I'm happy to report that AIG has paid back all that money with interest and is now clean. So, and even the government has, in the process of the bailout of AIG, the government acquired AIG stock, on which it also has made a profit. So it's an interesting story of very brave, insightful intervention by a central bank, and other authorities, the federal authorities, were also involved.
Now, let's take that example and let's consider a little bit how we can prevent that problem will not happen again. In the sense that you mentioned several mistakes. The first one was banks were lending money to people that could not pay back the money.
Well, they were forced to.
Or they were forced to do that. Okay, that would be.
That's not bank
that's
regulation.
That's easy to solve. But the second one that you mentioned, that I don't know if it is right or wrong doing this sort of packaging of this sort of loan. This is a subject that many economists working in the area, they don't really know if it is possible to extend banking regulation to those sort of packaging that are being done, that have a process of providing a lot of liquidity to that package that they are. But in a way, those packages in the United States and in several other countries are off the balance sheet items. So when you look at the consolidated financial system, you are not looking at that. So it's outside of the. You have any idea how we deal with
well,
that?
I mean, where I was going in that comment was that, packaging, how can you intervene in something as straightforward and simple as putting a bunch of securities in a package? But when the rating agencies put the AAA, I think that was a crime, and something where what was behind that was in the United States. The rating agencies were paid by the people they were rating, so the self-interest on their side was always to just accommodate what your clients are paying you for. And I think something has to be done to make rating much more truly objective and to create some sort of, if necessary, penalties for rating agencies that make serious mistakes. Even if those mistakes are unintentional, they should feel the pain or part of the pain when they create that pain.
Should there be a public rating agency?
Well, that's I'm not studying. This is not something that is my field that way. That I'm working in cost-benefit analysis and crossing bridges and roads and things like that. And I haven't really studied this problem, but as a broad general economic proposition, it's clear to me that the incentives were genuinely wrong for these rating agencies, and they did behave badly, and they caused a lot of trouble.
So I will keep asking the wrong kind of question because even if they are not in public finance and
no, I
know that you have a lot of experience.
I just don't.
Yeah,
I'm not able to go into that kind of detail.
Yeah, but you know that we are suffering probably more the consequence of these capital flows of macroeconomics and stability, and probably that's the topic of the agenda that we are most of the time talking about in our country at least. But let me go back a little bit to the modeling capital flows, and let's take the Lehman Brothers crisis. Immediately after that, well, you were looking at the crisis from the point of view of the U.S. economy and what happened to the portfolio holders in the rest of the world that would be affected if there was not that kind of successful intervention that happened in that crisis. But if we look at from the point of view of economies like Argentina that are in a way takers of those flows of volatility in those markets, again, we start to think about policy recommendations, and my question is, what do you think about those policy recommendations? That we were very happy that we were leaving behind capital controls in Latin America. Say in the 80s, in the 90s, there was a lot of restriction to capital flows, and we were removing that, and I was very happy to remove them when I have the possibility of having a lot of access to international capital market. But after Lehman Brothers, there was a strong recommendation coming from multilateral organizations too about reimposing restriction to capital flows. In the case of Chile, I remember that you remember that they put reserve requirements on loans coming from abroad.
Yeah.
We put some of them here, and I remember that in discussing those topics in the 90s, most of us were trying to remove the restriction to capital flow, because that, even if there is not, as you mentioned, an infinitely elastic supply curve of funds, those restrictions will operate removing the possibility of an arbitrage of interest rates. So interest rates are going to be higher as a consequence of those restrictions. Now, would you consider that emerging economies should reconsider the argument about capital control?
Well, I don't know about capital control. I'm certainly not a religious dogmatist on the subject, that's for sure. I don't know where to start here. Let's start with real exchange rates. And there are two, first of all, many times people think that all the central bank has to do is to raise the exchange rate, and that will stimulate exports and revive the economy and doing all of that. Well, I was working in El Salvador at one point in time when they had a very appreciated real exchange rate, and the agriculturists, the manufacturers, all of that were crying, said, why can the central bank be so stupid? This exchange rate is 5, they make it 10, we'll be in clover, why not make it 10? And I was leading a team before some presidential election trying to give analysis of the economy, and we were meeting with the representatives of agriculture, manufacturing, and all of that. And they were saying these things. And I said, you know, you're talking about the nominal exchange rate, and what you really should be thinking about is the real exchange rate. And a nominal move of the nominal rate is only going to have a very transitory effect on the real exchange rate. Why is the dollar so cheap here in El Salvador? Is because you have foreign aid coming in equal to 5% of GDP, and then you have Salvadorans in Los Angeles and elsewhere sending back 10% of GDP. You know, the Salvadoreños in Los Angeles earn an amount equal to the GDP of Los Angeles. And they send back 10% of the GDP of Los Angeles. Now, recently it's got as high as 18%. So I told these guys, well, if you want a high real exchange rate, what you got to do is tell your government, when the USAID comes and offers money, say no. And when your relatives out there are sending back all this stuff, say no, keep your money there. You can finance the tuition payments of our students when they go to college in the United States. That's fine, but don't send the money here. Okay, that's the way you have to think about the real exchange rate. It's a real phenomenon. Okay. So what can a country do if it wants to use the real exchange rate as a stimulus? It is not easy. But there are two excellent cases of successful targeting of the real exchange rate. One is Brazil during the Brazilian miracle period, and the other is Chile during the late 1980s. So I'll just talk a little bit about each of those. In Brazil, they had something of a crisis at the beginning of the period of the so-called Brazilian miracle period, around 1968 or thereabouts. And they decided they wanted a high real exchange rate. And how to do that? Well, they had lots of restrictions on imports at that time. They had prohibitions, they had quotas, they had all kinds of tariffs and so on like that. And so what they decided was, if we are accumulating more reserves than we want, we were sort of pegging the real rate in central bank actions, but that led to them acquiring and losing foreign exchange by that target. So what do? If they acquire too much foreign exchange? They liberalize, knock off some restrictions, eliminate some prohibitions, so on. And we were applauding like nobody's business. Came 1974, and there was a big oil price boom. And with this oil price boom, Brazil was an importer, so they started to lose foreign exchange. And the government put back on the restrictions to keep the real exchange rate where it was. And Mario Simonsen, a very excellent economist, was minister at that time. And I was at a conference in Sao Paulo with Afonso Pastore, whom some of you may know, who later became president of the Central Bank of Brazil, but he was professor at Sao Paulo at that time. And Simonsen came in a plane to Sao Paulo to make a presentation at our conference. But Pastore and I wanted to talk to Simonsen about this business of putting on the restrictions. And he said he didn't have time, but he was going in a limousine back to the airport, and why didn't we come with him? So we were the three of us in the back seat of the limousine, Pastore on one side, me on the other, Simonsen in the middle, and we were working on him, and he said, but I understand all of this, but you see, this need to raise the real exchange rate in the presence of this oil price boom is only transitory. We have just discovered oil in the ocean off of Rio and Sao Paulo there, and we're soon going to have a big production of oil, and so if we let the real exchange rate go up, we're going to have to let it go back down again, and we don't want to do that, and so we just put on these restrictions temporarily to accomplish our need. Well, they did. There was oil, but it took like two decades instead of 2 years before it really came in. And this experience gave me a thought of, I think, might be true about economic policy makers. You know, economic policy makers face terrible problems because they have all kinds of difficulties facing them, and they have very few instruments that they can actually use at any given time, so that they're frustrated that it isn't the Tinbergen problem of an equal number of instruments as objectives. You've got 10 times as many objectives as you have instruments, and what do you do? Well, the Simonsen experience led me to think that smart people, they look around and they find a scenario, a set of possibilities, which leaves them without a serious problem. And they then have a great urge to believe that that's true. And that is a trap, I think, into which many policymakers tend to fall.
Okay. Now, let me now go to one recommendation that you mentioned in the letter to the younger generation, but I want to mix that with another question in the previous interview, because what you consider in the letter to the younger generation, you say that the professional economists should emphasize fundamentals. So fundamentals in the sense that let's look to the traditional framework of utility maximizing or profit maximizing in consumers and producers. And you ask yourself the question there, are we emphasizing fundamentals? And then you give an answer. But then in the other interview, Richard Just, I will read that. Let me turn to the fifth criticism you address in the three postulate paper, which had to do with obsolescence due to rebel preference analysis. It had to do with further refinement that you suggested in relation to non-market goods. For example, that didn't lend themselves to a measurement in national income. Is it possible to have a further perspective now, given some of the more recent developments? For example, in behavioral welfare economics, they have tried to take account of mistakes in decision-making or ancillary conditions that cause decision to differ from straight utility maximization. Is it possible to bring those kind of things and other non-market issues legitimately into refining the national income measure? So this is a kind of academic question. I know that we were talking about policy, but this is something that we are observing day after day about these Kahneman studies that utility maximization or profit maximization may not be the right way of dealing with problems.
Well, I think that there are interesting discoveries in behavioral economics, but I don't think that they impinge on the measurement of national income or GDP or whatnot and whatnot. There is no sense in the world in trying to add to the GDP the work that you do when you wash the dishes at night. You know, well, what use are we going to put that thing to? We're going to have to clean it up in order to work with the accounts the way they are. We want the wages and salaries and so on to link with what people spend money on, that kind of stuff. So I like the idea of people looking into people's motives and things like that. I am more paternalistic than many free market economists in the sense that I feel, let's say, in the United States we have some private universities that advertise, we're going to make you a career, you poor person coming out of the army, we're going to make you a career as a medical technician or as a computer expert or something like that. And you come with us and you pay tuition, which is paid there by the federal government for the benefit of the former service people. So the federal government's paying all this money, and these guys get a lousy education, and they never get the kind of job that they were led to believe they were going to get, you see. So I think I wouldn't mind if it were mandatory that schools would have a record of what happens to their alumni by each branch of study, even. And that should be public information so that people can make informed choices about that. I think that's reasonable. I think that other ways in which, shady guys, shady people take advantage of the ignorance of poor and ill-educated people, that I think it's reasonable that the government should try to protect those poor people from the blandishments of the scalpers that are trying to take their money away, So I think that this kind of lesson from behavioral economics, that we're trying to intervene where there is a reasonable consensus that the action in question is not for the good of society. I don't mind that. I don't know if that's an answer or not.
No, okay. Now let me go to another topic that it is related to Argentina, but maybe to several other countries too. That it has to do with. I know that this is a subject that you have not been working in your academic life, but I know that you have thought about that. That's those areas of public choice or an institutionalism. And what fine in the case of Argentina and in other countries too, is that all the recommendations that we may have from taxation and welfare or project analysis, sometimes they have to fight with some other ideas that are the ones that are politically correct. So most of the time the good policy recommendations are not politically correct. Why that happen in some countries more than in others, that is too tough to go through the policy recommendations that will increase welfare and remove distortions? What you have thought about that?
Well, we get this in some sense in project evaluation a lot, that our economic analysis is oriented toward economic efficiency. And so we can tell you that this project has a net present value of $10 million, and this other project has a negative net present value, so you shouldn't do it. We can tell you that. But we're only counting, or we're mainly counting, the benefits that we can measure in economic terms. Now, we measure benefits that are not in cash. We can estimate with some success the value of commuter time that is saved when you make the commuting shorter, you see. So that's the benefit of a highway project, but we get that in there just fine. But there are other things that we really can't take into account. So I am a modest advocate of cost-benefit analysis. In the real world, you have a terrible time selling the top brass on the idea, let's do cost-benefit analysis. And then one day they have an epiphany like Paul on the road to Damascus. And they say, oh, cost benefit analysis. You know, I worry about so many problems. And here they give me the solution for these problems. So we're going to demand that they do cost benefit analysis on every expenditure that we have, every investment, every this, every that. And then I go on the other side, I say, no, don't, please. And then I have a tripartite division there. One is the projects that we know how to do, the ports, the roads, the irrigation projects, that kind of thing. We know really how to do. Then there are other things that we need help from the government, but we are ready to take the help. So, on carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere, not you, not me, not the Environmental Protection Agency, not anybody in the world knows the value of, how much cost to society is involved from putting another ton of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It might be $10, it might be $100, and we don't know. What I want is for somebody to tell me $20, any number, $30. And I can then introduce efficiency in the sense that I will promote controlling emissions when controlling them costs less than $30 a ton. And I will say no to methods that cost more than $30 a ton. So I am saving society money by making this critical shadow price, but I can't tell you what that price should be. And we have similar things with respect to the alleviation of poverty. We think in terms of basic needs externalities, that society has a willingness to pay to raise the nutrition level of people who are ill-nourished, or raise the education level of people who otherwise would be ill-educated, medical care and so on. And if we want to rationalize policy in those respects, what you need are, just like the value of the ton of carbon dioxide, you need to move somebody from level 70 to level 80 in nutrition when norm is maybe 100. We're willing to pay an extra 50% to move them from 70 to 80, but only an extra 20% from 80 to 90, and we're not willing to pay anything to move them from 90 to 100. And the government has to tell me that I cannot put those numbers and say, I derived these by economic experimentation. So, I don't know if that helps, but that's where I am.
Okay, now, one point that is related to attending the basic needs, and I think that that helps a lot in the long run. Sometime in the short run, when we are having a lot of problems, we have a lot of externalities. Let's say that they have a welfare impact in the society, and now that we are in an election year, you have thought about externalities or some recommendation how to deal with all other type of problem like crime, drugs. I know that Gary Becker did a lot of that, but you have a close contact with that. But we are suffering in Argentina at this particular time a lot about that, a lot. It was not that way in the past, but I know that the economy have always been dealing and analyzing those sort of externalities. But you have any idea on that point? This is the last one, so later, after that question, we will ask the audience to ask questions. But these are very related to what is going on in Argentina today, and it should be nice to hear you about that.
Well, let me start with a notion that is not widely enough appreciated. And that is something that you learn in statistics, which is the error of the first kind and the error of the second kind. I think one can evolve a whole philosophy around errors of the first kind and errors of the second kind. And a great deal of subtlety is involved in that whole story. Consider speed limits. That we make the speed limit 100 kilometers per hour, and we get a certain amount of accidents and deaths and so on. We make it 120 and people move faster and have a lot of benefit from that, but we get more costs of accidents and deaths. We make it 20 kilometers per hour and we don't get any accidents and no deaths, but God, we're all stuck in traffic all the time. We're never moving, you see. So you have that issue almost anywhere in the act of legislation, that you're drawing lines, and if you drew it here, you drew it here, you drew it here. And people simply, most of the time, don't even think about that. And I feel that if there's any one message to be put across, is yes, you should be thinking about the error of the first kind and the second kind, no matter where you're going, in health policy, in crime policy. You're too lenient in crime policy, and you have lots of criminals who go unpunished. You're too rough in crime policy, and you put too many innocent people in jail. So there you go. You have to be conscious of this subtle issue that comes up in almost every single law or regulation that anybody puts.
Ahora vamos a tomar preguntas de la audiencia. Pueden hacerlas en castellano o en inglés. Tenemos aproximadamente unos 15 minutos más, así que están invitados a preguntar.
Yeah, when you were talking about inflation and deflation and the willingness of people of holding currency and as a percentage of GDP, what are the values that you consider people are thinking about when deciding how much money they want to keep in their balances, other than the growth of the economy and so on and so forth?
Well, who knows? I mean, the old, it really depends. I had a student from Ecuador some years back who was doing a monetary thesis, and we had learned in every textbook that the demand for money, it depends on your income and on the interest rate. And when the interest rate goes up, you demand less money, and when the interest rate goes down, you demand more money. That's in every textbook. And I said, I was in Chile in the late 1970s when if you put your money in a 30-day renewable financiera deposit, you would be getting 2 or 3% real on that. And if you made that investment in 1975 and kept it until the middle of 1981, you did better than any other investment that you possibly would have made. It was better than the stock market, better than land, better than house rents, better than anything. And so one of the motives that people can have for holding money is when money pays interest, that they will hold more. And in this thesis from Maria Belén Freire, she did analysis of several countries of demand for real monetary balances, and found that simply adding the interest rate paid on time and saving deposits into the demand for money cut the unexplained variance in half. And she was doing this around the turn of the century, so to speak, and it had never been done before. Crazy. But the other motives are, the usual ones of you want liquidity, you want precautionary motives, and so on. But that's the answer.
Gracias por la conversación. Diste una sugerencia interesante respecto a los egresados de universidades, de ciertas carreras, para ver cómo le ha ido en el futuro. Que yo sepa, en América Latina no lo hace nadie eso, pero hay un único país en América Latina, es el único, que mide anualmente el nivel de conocimiento de todos los graduados universitarios, que es Brasil. Brasil tiene el ENADE, que es un examen que todos los años tienen que recibir los graduados, los economistas, los médicos, los ingenieros, y luego publican los resultados por facultad de origen. Entonces uno tiene una clara idea de cuál es el nivel en cada una de las disciplinas, cada una de las universidades. Pero ninguno hace lo que vos estás sugiriendo, que es ver cómo le va en la vida futura profesional, ¿no?
Que ganan.
Claro. Bueno, los chilenos tienen un sistema en que van poniendo cuánto gana cada profesión en cada región de Chile. Los recién graduados, 5 años de ejercicio, 10 años de ejercicio, pero no lo diferencian por universidades. Es el total de los ingenieros, de los médicos, ¿no? Acá no tenemos ninguno de los dos sistemas.
Well, it's a good start. It's a good start, and I think it should be done more frequently, and it should ideally, when you have a problem such as we have with these universities in the United States, ITT and University of Phoenix in particular, it's somehow it has to do with truth in advertising. That it's incorrect for educational institutions to take 3 or 4 years of a person's life and a lot of money and then not deliver on what they were led to expect. That's true.
¿La pregunta?
Perdón. Usted habló de Singapur. El mes pasado se cumplieron 50 años de donde ellos decidieron dejar de ser pobres. Es un país rico en este momento y alrededor tiene todos países pobres. El control social es el mismo en todos lados. ¿Qué hicieron adentro en la parte, además de reglas claras y todo lo demás que conocemos, institucionalización y todo eso? ¿Cómo se manejaron interiormente, digamos, el grupo dominante para poder no tener problemas con digamos, que eso siga para adelante, sigan invirtiendo toneladas de dinero ahí de todo lugar del mundo? ¿No? Please, por favor, Roque, la idea es que adentro.
I didn't catch it all in Spanish.
Yeah, the point is that after 50 years around Singapore, made a strong decision to produce a structural reform in the economy, and it was very successful. All the neighbors, they kept very, very poor. And la pregunta final, ¿cuál era?
No, la parte interna, porque la parte interna,
¿qué es lo que hizo posible?
Pero me refiero a cómo se arreglaron adentro, digamos, el grupo dominante, que ahora, por ejemplo, está el hijo de Mr. Lee manejando la situación.
O sea, ¿cómo pudieron lograr el consenso político para...
Claro, eso lo hizo Mr. Lee, dijo, agarró la manija con el comunismo, y dijo, muchachos, olvídense del comunismo, arreglamos con los británicos. Eso lo dijo hace 45 años. A los 4 años, 3 años ganó el ejército y se quedó con todo. Por eso hace 50 que el tipo de cosas seguimos con, hacemos capitalismo, no de comunismo.
Pero hoy día Singapur es una democracia, ¿cómo funciona?
No, es
autocracia.
es prácticamente una teocracia, no tienen lo que pasa es que viven ahí son 600 kilómetros cuadrados de la ciudad de Buenos Aires y tienen 5 millones de personas y los que nacieron ahí, desde el día que nacieron hasta el día que se mueren, tiene todo resuelto. El tipo más capaz va a ir a la universidad, va a ir a publicar de otro lado, los menos capaces tendrán su trabajo, pero yo lo que voy es al grupo dominante, digamos, porque el problema que tenemos nosotros, argentinos, me parece, es la organización de los gobiernos. Te das cuenta que vos has acertado en eso. Es decir, cómo coordinan adentro, porque vos ves, ponen una banda verde, la foto de lo que va a haber ahí, y en 8 o 10 meses está el edificio. Lo planifican, lo tienen, lo contratan.
If you think that there is something special about the internal and political organization of Singapore that made things happen there and to keep free market policy.
Well, I mean, Singapore as a country is the creation of one man, Lee Kuan Yew. And Lee Kuan Yew, I forget whether it was Oxford or Cambridge that he went to, but they say that he was the best student they had in 50 years.
50 years.
So he is an absolute genius, you know, and a man of very high character. And if you want to say something nice about autocracy, you just look at Singapore. You know that they did some bad things, like it's not legal to chew gum. Because you
what to say?
But
that's the case of the usual assumption that we do. Let's assume that we have a benevolent dictator. Then you get the optimum, you know?
That's right. But I must say that the countries surrounding Singapore are part of the Asian miracle. That is to say, in Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, now Vietnam are all countries that have had growth at 6, 7, 8, 9% per year. And maybe they haven't equaled Singapore, but they sure have beaten a lot of Latin American countries.
Jorge.
You said something very decent about it being a lot easier to improve tax policy with the economists, that expenditure policy was a lot more complicated, I guess, because of the political process. But what is your broad view from the point of view of project evaluation? Which countries have progressed more in doing a better job at doing spending?
Well, it's still in its infancy. There is little doubt that up until now, Chile is the champion in this part of the world, and maybe among the developing countries anywhere in the world. They instituted a system of evaluation of public sector investment projects back in the 1970s, and it was supported by a course in the Universidad Católica de Chile that Ernesto Fontaine ran for 30 years, and that course would have maybe 50 participants per year. It went for an entire year, and they had classes for 6 months and then practical projects for 6 months, projects given them by the ministries. There were real projects, and there were 4 or 5 of those projects per year done by the people in the course. These projects were reviewed by a national and international panel, of which I was always a member for 30 years. So you had 3,000 people going out and they had ended up, not all of them, but let's say half of them end up in jobs in the ministry, in project evaluation, in the provinces, in the consulting firms that do the project evaluation, and so on. There is a body of people capable of doing this. And in addition, they gave short courses in the provinces, in different places, and in other ministries, so that probably another 10,000 people were given these shorter courses. So I think that idea of supporting a system with well-trained people is absolutely critical. There is another problem that happens, that countries get to love project evaluation. Say, we're going to do it on every project. And I have been to some countries in which they come to me and they say, gee, we're so proud. We evaluated 10,000 projects last year. And then I ask, well, who do you have on your staff who does this? Oh, they say, we have 400 people who do this. Well, where were they trained? Well, we had this course for a week in this place, and we had that course for a week and 2 weeks in another place. Nothing comparable to what they have in Chile. So these people don't really understand much. They know they have a formula that they have to fill out, and they know how to put these numbers in. But I asked them, which major project have you stopped? That the government, you told the government it's dumb to do this. And they usually can't tell me even one. It's that bad. And I tell them then that if all you're doing is putting a rubber stamp on the project, I want to do a project evaluation of your system of project evaluation. And I come to a negative answer. All you're doing is wasting money. You're just approving everything that they do.
Pero, Lito, en Argentina es igual. Hay una ley, hay un decreto del Poder Ejecutivo y hay una resolución del Ministerio de Economía que dicen que no puede entrar ningún proyecto al presupuesto nacional si no se hizo la tasa de retorno, el cost benefit y los precios sombra. El único problema es que no se cumple ninguno de los
Después, Javier, después tomamos 2 preguntas más y levantamos, ¿no? O otra más puede ser. Adelante.
Yes, I'm concerned about the comment you made just before that you can have the knowledge for project evaluation and the trained professionals, but if you don't have the bureaucratic incentives to do the right numbers, the people can be trained, but in William Niskanin's book of Bureaucracy and Representative Government, he is very skeptical about project evaluation because he says bureaucracies will always try to expand their areas of influence, and the project evaluation would only be a process to justify action.
Well, we have pieces and pieces and pieces. I keep saying that in project evaluation, we have a problem too. In that, most of the time, the people who are paying for the project evaluation have an answer that they like better than the other answer. And the persons who do the project evaluation can be completely craven and just say, well, we're going to make it come out that way, which we have plenty of that. But when we do the scientific project evaluation, we say this is a profession. And we have the basic postulates of economics, and we have to abide by them. How can we keep ourselves honest? Evaluation should be available publicly. Everybody should be able to see it, and everybody should be able to criticize it. That's the best answer that I have to make sure that things are being done well when they are being done.
Javier.
As you were talking about real exchange rate and inflation, what do you think is the importance of the level of international reserve of the central bank in these two variables? And also, I'd like to ask you if you think that the solvency or insolvency of any central bank has any relevance in its ability to apply monetary policy or any other of its functions.
Well, I think we don't have any sort of clear way to say, well, the central bank's international reserve should be 30% of M2 or 12% or 60% or whatnot. And we have successful economies where this number is high, like Singapore, and we have successful countries where this number is more moderate. So I think obviously if you have a fixed exchange rate, you need a lot more foreign reserves than if you have a flexible exchange rate. If you have a flexible exchange rate, when I tell my students is when somebody says we have a flexible exchange rate, that is only opening a door, because you can have a flexible exchange rate and the central bank can be keeping the actual nominal rate within a 2% band, and it's still a flexible rate, you know. And a 10% band is a flexible rate, and a 50% band is a flexible rate. So you have to learn what the objectives of the central bank are. And here I would say that we have the fixed exchange rate countries. They are successful and lucky when the flow of foreign exchange into the country tends to be pretty steady and even and not subject to great fluctuations. Panama is the perfect example because its big foreign exchange flow is Canal Zone revenues, and they don't change even in a big recession in the world. They just keep coming in, and we may bounce a little bit up and down, but not much. But countries that where they have major primary commodity exports as big items in their balance of payments, they are subject to big ups and downs, and therefore big changes in the equilibrium real exchange rate, and they're always subject to a big trouble. Fixed rates, the adjustment works perfectly almost when the price level has to go up. So I was in Moscow for the first time in January of 00, and the last time in Moscow was in January of 2010. So 10 years. The exchange rate was 28 and something when I got there first, and it was 28 and something when I got there last. And in the meantime, the price level had more than tripled. Now, how did that happen? This was not normal inflation. This was a real exchange rate adjustment owing to what? The abundance of foreign currency coming in. And the natural adjustment was an equilibrium rise in the price level. If they had kept the price level constant, the nominal exchange rate would have had to go down to like 8. Well, nobody wants that kind of deflation pressed on their manufacturing industry or something like that. So it happens, and the issue with fixed exchange rates is when the equilibrium price level has to go down a lot. And Argentina had a little bit of this in the 1990s, and Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland are all suffering that thing. and Milton Friedman, who was a advocate more than I of fixed exchange rates. I lean to fixed exchange rates, but I don't just embrace them as an answer to everything. I think many successful countries have had success with fixed exchange rates, but they have been lucky by not having these big pressures down. But Milton Friedman said when you have a need for the price level to go down by 25% or half or something like that, push it down like that, it's like cutting the tail of a dog 1 inch at a time. And have a big devaluation and you're cutting the tail. You have a one-time adjustment. And I think that is a very wise comment of Friedman.
Well, we appreciate Professor Harberger answering the question and participating in this interview. We are very, very happy that you visit us during this time. And we are very thankful for your answer and your advice. Thank you very much.
Well, it went pretty well, I thought. Pero ustedes no son los únicos.
Muchos alumnos. Mi primo Tomás Marín.
Ah, que mira. ¿Dónde está ahora?
Si en este momento estamos Te pido un favor, ¿me puedes sacar una foto con él?
Sí, sí, yo también quiero una así con eso.
Yeah.